All right, strap yourselves in because we are going deep on a topic that's, well, it's been heating up lately. Cold fusion. That thing that basically got tossed into the sci-fi bin for like
Yeah.
forever. Well, it might be time to blow the dust off those old paperbacks because there are some new developments that have even the biggest skeptics kind of, scratching their heads.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see this kind of renewed interest.
Yeah.
For a long time, cold fusion was like the ultimate scientific dead end.
Right.
But now we're seeing some pretty serious institutions, even government agencies, taking another look.
Exactly. We've got a whole stack of articles and research papers here. And I gotta admit, some of this stuff is, well, it's pretty mind-bending. So, for those who need a quick refresher, we're talking about achieving nuclear fusion, that holy grail of clean energy, but doing it at room temperature. No giant, crazy, expensive reactors needed.
And that's the whole point, right?
Right?
If we could crack the code on cold fusion, make it work reliably, make it efficient, I mean, it would be a total game changer.
Sure. Absolutely. Okay, so let's jump right into one of the biggest things that caught my eye. ARPA, that US government agency that funds all the cutting edge research. Well, they just dropped a cool $10 million grant specifically for cold fusion research. Now, 10 million might not sound like much in the grand scheme of, government spending, but in the world of cold fusion research, that's a huge AG deal. What do you think triggered this sudden influx of cash?
Well, it's not exactly sudden. There's been this like growing feeling among some scientists that cold fusion might actually be worth another shot. For one thing, the tech we have now for detecting and measuring tiny energy changes, it's gotten so much better. We could actually see stuff happening at the atomic level that, a couple decades ago was just impossible.
So it's not that the science itself has changed, but our ability to even study it has like leaped forward.
Exactly. And I think that's a big part of why ARPE jumped in. They're looking for those high risk, high reward projects. And they clearly see enough potential in cold fusion to put some serious money behind it.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got the funding piece figured out. Let's talk about the actual research that's going on. One of the articles we have here digs into using palladium nanoparticles in cold fusion experiments. Now, I'll be honest, I'm no physicist. So, can you help break down why palladium is so important here?
Okay, so palladium is this really interesting element. It has this unique ability to like absorb huge amounts of hydrogen. And remember, the whole point of cold fusion is to figure out how to get nuclear reactions going, but at way lower temperatures than, traditional hot fusion.
Right, with those gigantic superheated reactors. So, where do the palladium nanoparticles fit into all of this?
Well, the idea is that if you load up palladium with hydrogen, you might be able to create these conditions where fusion can happen, even at room temperature. And nanoparticles are especially cool because they're so tiny, right? They have this massive surface area for their size, and that could really boost these reactions.
So, they're basically trying to use these palladium nanoparticles as like tiny little fusion reactors.
Kinda, yeah. For example, there are these researchers at the European Synchrotron Radiation Facility. They're using these crazy powerful X-rays to literally watch what happens at the atomic level when these nanoparticles are loaded with hydrogen.
Wow, they're actually seeing these reactions happen in real time.
It's incredible. And what they're finding is that, well, the behavior of these nanoparticles can be pretty complex
Yeah.
and kind of unpredictable. But that unpredictability is actually what makes it so exciting. It means there's a lot more going on than we thought.
Okay, so we've got these palladium nanoparticles potentially acting like mini fusion reactors. But how do scientists even know if fusion is happening? What are they looking for?
That's a great question. And it brings us to one of the most, well, let's just say, hotly debated topics in the field: excess heat. The basic idea is that if fusion is happening, even on a super tiny scale, it should create some extra heat. Heat that you wouldn't expect from normal chemical
So
reactions.
we're not talking about giant explosions or like blinding flashes of light.
Nope, it's much more subtle than that. Scientists use these crazy sensitive devices called calorimeters to measure even the tiniest temperature changes. If they see a spike in heat that they can't explain any other way, well, that's a potential sign that fusion might be happening.
So it's all about finding these tiny but telltale signs of extra energy being released. And I imagine measuring that excess heat accurately is really tricky, right?
It is, and that's where a lot of the controversy comes in. Even the smallest differences in how you set up the experiment, the type of calorimeter you use, the materials, all of that can lead to totally different results. And that's what fuels the skeptics, right? They argue that some of these reported cases of excess heat might just be errors in measurement, or some other weird phenomena that we don't understand yet.
So the debate about whether or not this excess heat is actually coming from cold fusion is still going strong.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why it's so important to approach this whole field with, a healthy dose of skepticism. But also, you got to be open to the possibility that something really groundbreaking might be happening.
Right. It's all about finding that balance between skepticism and open-mindedness.
Okay, so we've got palladium, nanoparticles, and the quest for excess heat. But there's another piece of this that I find really interesting. The connection between cold fusion and its, let's call it its hot cousin, traditional fusion research.
Yeah. I mean, they might seem worlds apart, but there are some pretty cool parallels, and maybe even some potential for crossover between the two.
Exactly. We have these massive multi-billion-dollar projects like ITER in France trying to create a mini sun on Earth. How could something like that possibly be relevant to cold fusion research?
Well, for starters, the material science involved in building a reactor that can withstand those crazy temperatures and pressures in traditional fusion, it's incredibly advanced, and some of those same materials, or at least the ideas behind them, could be used in cold fusion reactors someday.
So even if cold fusion doesn't work out, the research on traditional fusion could still have benefits for other areas of science and technology. Absolutely, it's a win-win. And there are other connections too. For instance, researchers at MIT are working on these new materials that can handle the insane heat inside a fusion reactor, like ITER. Those materials could be crucial for building cold fusion reactors that are more, robust and efficient, assuming, of course, that we can get them to work reliably in the first place.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've got funding, we've got fascinating research with nanoparticles, and we've got potential connections with traditional fusion research. It's starting to feel like cold fusion might actually have a shot this time around.
There's definitely a lot more optimism now than there was, say, 20 years ago. But we also got to be realistic about the challenges, right? And I think one of the biggest ones, maybe the elephant in the room, is reproducibility.
Right, we can't ignore that. Cold fusion has a long and, let's say, complicated history. And one of the biggest criticisms has always been the lack of consistent results.
Exactly. One experiment might show some really promising signs of excess heat, but then another lab tries to do the same thing and gets completely different results. That inconsistency has been a major roadblock.
Okay, so let's dig into that a little bit. Why is reproducibility so crucial in science, and why has cold fusion had such a hard time with it?
Well, in any scientific field, reproducibility is like the gold standard. It means that if you follow the same steps, use the same materials, the same equipment, you should get the same results. No matter who's doing the experiment or where they're doing it, it's how we know that our findings are real, that they're not just, flukes or mistakes.
So if different labs are getting totally different results when they study cold fusion, it kind of makes you wonder if it's even real, right?
Exactly. And there are a few reasons why cold fusion has struggled so much with this. One is that the experiments themselves are super complex and sensitive. Even tiny variations in the materials, how you prepare the samples, the equipment you use, all of that can have a huge impact on the results.
So it's kind of like baking a cake. If you don't follow the recipe exactly, you might end up with a totally different cake every time.
That's a great analogy. And another challenge is that, well, we still don't fully understand how cold fusion works.
Hmm.
Unlike with traditional fusion, where we have a decent grasp of the physics, cold fusion is still a bit of a mystery.
So we're essentially trying to create and study something that we don't even fully understand. That sounds ridiculously hard.
It is. And that lack of a solid theoretical framework makes it even harder to design experiments that are truly reproducible. We're still looking for those key variables, those specific conditions that make cold fusion possible.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle without knowing what the picture on the box looks like.
Exactly. But the good news is that, despite all these challenges, there are some signs that the field is starting to take reproducibility more seriously.
Okay, so what are they doing about it?
Well, one big thing is the focus on standardizing experimental procedures. Researchers are actually working together to develop more detailed, more rigorous protocols for doing these experiments. The goal is to minimize the variations between different labs.
So they're trying to create like a universal recipe for cold fusion experiments.
Exactly. They're also working on making their measurements more accurate and sensitive. For example, they're developing new types of calorimeters that are less prone to errors and outside influences.
So it's not just about using the same recipe, it's also about making sure your oven is calibrated correctly.
Exactly. And another important thing is open sharing of data and methods. In the past, there was a lot of secrecy. probably because of all the controversy. But now there's a growing realization that collaboration and transparency are essential.
So there's a real shift happening from secrecy to more open collaboration.
Absolutely, and that's a really good sign. If we want to convince the world that cold fusion is real and worth pursuing, we need to be able to show that our results are consistent and that anyone can replicate them.
Okay, so reproducibility is still a big hurdle, but at least there are some concrete steps being taken to address it. That's encouraging. But I'm curious, is all the research just focused on palladium? Are there other materials that might work for cold fusion?
You're right, palladium isn't the only game in town. It's definitely been the most studied material so far. But there are other possibilities. In fact, there's been growing interest in nickel hydrogen systems as a potential alternative.
Nickel hydrogen, huh? Why nickel?
Well, for one thing, nickel is way more abundant and cheaper than palladium. If we ever want to make cold fusion commercially viable, using something like nickel would be a huge advantage.
That makes sense. Are there other reasons why nickel is getting attention?
Yeah, some researchers think that nickel hydrogen systems might be better suited for certain types of reactions that could lead to cold fusion. We're still trying to figure out exactly how it works. But there's definitely a lot of excitement about nickel as a potential player in the cold fusion game.
So we've got palladium and nickel as the main contenders, each with its own pros and cons. But even with all this new research and the efforts to improve reproducibility, there's still this big question looming. Do we even understand how cold fusion works at a fundamental level?
That is the million-dollar question. And honestly, we're still a long way from having a complete answer.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. Why is it so important to have a solid theoretical understanding of something like cold fusion? I mean, if we're seeing excess heat, if we're seeing these reactions happening, isn't that enough?
Well, it's kind of like having a car that runs, but you have no idea how the engine works. You might be able to drive it, but if something breaks, you're going to have a hard time fixing it. And you definitely can't build a better car without understanding the basic principles behind it.
So without a good theory, we're basically just messing around in the dark, hoping for the best.
Kinda, yeah. And that's a big reason why cold fusion has faced so much skepticism. Without a theoretical foundation to explain how it works, it's hard for people to take it seriously.
Right, it's like saying you can fly without understanding the laws of aerodynamics.
Exactly. And that's where the real challenge lies. Because if cold fusion is really happening, it means there's something fundamental we're missing in our current understanding of physics.
So it's not just about finding a way to make cold fusion work, it's about potentially rewriting our understanding of how the universe works.
That's the potential implication.
Mm.
And that's what makes this field so incredibly exciting and also incredibly daunting.
All right, so we've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive. We've talked about the renewed interest in cold fusion, the research with palladium and nickel, and the whole issue of reproducibility. But we've also highlighted this big elephant in the room, the lack of a solid theoretical framework. So, where do we go from here? Is there any reason to be optimistic about the future of cold fusion, or are we just chasing a scientific pipe dream? We'll tackle those questions and more in the second part of our deep dive into cold fusion.
All right, so we're back, and I gotta say, my head's still spinning a bit after that deep dive into the science of cold fusion. This is, well, it's complex stuff.
It is, but hey, that's what makes it so interesting, right? It's one of those fields where we're still asking those really basic questions, still
Right.
trying to push the boundaries of what we know.
Absolutely. So let's pick up where we left off. We were talking about the lack of a solid theory behind cold fusion, which is obviously a huge challenge. But are there any theories out there, even if they're like still kind of speculative, that try to explain how cold fusion might even be possible?
There are a few. But honestly, none of them have really gained, widespread acceptance yet. One idea that's been around for a while involves something called quantum tunneling.
Quantum tunneling. Okay, you're going to have to break that down for me. That sounds like something straight out of Star Trek.
It does sound a bit sci-fi, right? But it's a real thing in quantum mechanics. Basically, it means that particles can sometimes pass through barriers that, according to classical physics, they shouldn't be able to.
So, like walking through walls?
Well, not exactly. It's more like, imagine you roll a ball up a hill, and instead of stopping at the top, it just poof, disappears, and then reappears on the other side.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. But how does this tie into cold fusion?
The idea is that in a cold fusion setup, quantum tunneling might allow hydrogen nuclei to overcome their natural repulsion. and get close enough to each other to actually fuse.
So instead of needing those crazy high temperatures and pressures to force the nuclei together, they could just kind of like tunnel through that energy barrier.
Exactly. Now, this is just one theory, and it's still, early days. We don't have any proof that quantum tunneling is actually involved in cold fusion, but it's definitely an interesting area of research.
It is. It definitely makes you think, okay, so we've got this theoretical puzzle to solve, and we talked about the whole reproducibility problem. But let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about what cold fusion could mean for the world, if we can actually make it work.
Yeah. The what if scenario everyone gets excited about. And for good reason. I mean, the possibilities are huge.
Okay, so let's indulge in a little what if thinking for a minute. Paint me a picture of what the world might look like if cold fusion became a reality.
All right. Well, first and foremost, it would completely change how we produce energy. Imagine a world where we can generate clean, safe energy, basically limitless energy, without needing fossil fuels or those giant power plants.
No more oil spills, no more greenhouse gases, no more dependence on, unstable energy markets. That's a pretty amazing picture.
It is. And it goes way beyond just the environmental and economic benefits. Having access to that kind of energy, abundant and cheap, could have huge social and geopolitical implications.
Okay, so let's break that down. How could cold fusion reshape the world on, like, a global scale?
Well, for one thing, it could help level the playing field between rich and poor countries. A lot of developing countries just don't have access to reliable, affordable energy, and that holds them back in terms of economic growth and quality of life. Cold fusion could change all of that.
So it's not just about replacing dirty energy with clean energy. It's about making sure everyone has access to the energy they need.
Exactly. And it could also have a big impact on global security. Think about it. So much of the conflict in the world today is driven by competition for resources, especially fossil fuels.
Right, we've seen wars fought over oil, and countries can be vulnerable to political pressure if they're dependent on other countries for energy.
Exactly. Cold fusion could, in theory, eliminate those vulnerabilities. If every country had its own independent, abundant energy source, it would completely change the balance of power.
Wow, it's hard to even imagine the scale of the impact. But I guess that's what happens with truly disruptive technologies, right? They change everything.
They do. And cold fusion, if it ever works the way we hope it could, would be one of the most disruptive technologies in history.
It would definitely be up there with fire in the wheel, that's for sure. Okay, so we've painted this like really optimistic picture of what cold fusion could bring. But let's get back to reality for a second. Let's say we can get cold fusion to work reliably and safely. What kind of engineering challenges might we face in actually scaling it up, making it commercially viable?
That's a great question, and something researchers are actively working on. One of the biggest challenges would be designing reactors that are both efficient and, affordable. We need to get more energy out of the system than we put in, and we need to do it in a way that makes sense economically, even on a large scale.
Right, we don't want to end up with a technology that only the super rich can afford.
Exactly. And another challenge is safety. Even at low temperatures, nuclear reactions still involve radiation. So we need to make absolutely sure that these systems are designed and operated in a way that minimizes any risk.
So safety and containment would be top priorities.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole issue of integration. How do we fit cold fusion into our current energy infrastructure? Do we need to build whole new power grids? How do we adapt transportation systems to run on this new type of energy?
It sounds like we'd have to rethink our entire energy ecosystem.
In a lot of ways, yeah.
Yeah.
But these are good problems to have, right? If we're even at the point where we're thinking about these engineering challenges, it means we've already solved the basic scientific problems.
That's true. It's like we're putting the cart before the horse, getting excited about all the potential applications before we've even proven that it works.
Well, that's human nature, right? We're always looking ahead, imagining the possibilities. But you're right, we need to stay focused on the research.
Okay, so time for a reality check. We've talked about the benefits, the challenges, the theoretical questions. But bottom line, where are we right now with cold fusion? Is it a real technology or is it still just, a scientific curiosity?
I think it's fair to say that cold fusion is still very much an open question. The research is going strong, and there have been some exciting results.
Yeah.
But we're not even close to having definitive proof that it works, let alone that we can scale it up to make it practical.
So maybe hold off on investing in those cold fusion startups for now.
Probably a good idea,
Hmm.
but it's a field worth keeping an eye on. The potential payoff is so huge that even a slim chance of success is worth exploring.
Right, it's a long shot, but a long shot with potential to change everything. And I guess that's what makes it so fascinating, right? It's a story that's still unfolding, and we're all watching to see what happens next.
Yeah, hey, who knows? Maybe one of our listeners will be the one to make that breakthrough discovery that finally unlocks the secrets of cold fusion.
Now that would be something. Okay, we've covered a lot in this second part of our deep dive. We've explored some of the theories, imagined the potential impact, and wrestled with those engineering challenges. But there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to look at: the human factor. How has the scientific community reacted to cold fusion over the years, and how has that reaction shaped the field? We'll dig into that and more in the final part of our cold fusion deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive into cold fusion. We've covered the science, the potential benefits, the engineering hurdles, but there's another layer to this whole thing, one that often gets overlooked: the human element. Cold fusion has had, well, let's just say, a colorful history, and I think it's important to understand how the scientific community has reacted to it over the years. What do you think? Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, the human side of the cold fusion story is just as interesting as the science itself. It's a story about, big hopes and shattered dreams, fierce rivalries, and a whole lot of controversy.
Right. When you really think about it, cold fusion is one of those rare scientific topics that's really captured the public imagination. It's been in movies, books, even TV shows. It almost feels kind of mythical, you know?
It does, and I think that's part of the appeal, right? This idea of achieving nuclear fusion, but at room temperature. No massive reactors, just like a simple experiment. It sounds almost too good to be true.
It does, but like we've been discussing, the science behind cold fusion is really complex, and we still don't fully understand it. And that's where the human element comes in. Because science isn't just about, facts and figures, it's about people
Yeah.
and how they interpret those facts and figures.
Absolutely. Science is a human endeavor, which means it's affected by all the same stuff that affects us in every other part of life.
Yeah.
Biases, emotions, social pressure.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock a bit.
Yeah.
Back to 1989. Two scientists, Martin Fleischmann and Stanley Pons, announced to the world that they've achieved cold fusion. In a tabletop experiment, no less. It was a huge deal, sent shockwaves through the entire scientific community.
It did. And at first, everyone was super excited. The idea of clean, limitless energy, it was incredibly appealing. The media went crazy. It felt like the world was about to change.
It did. But then things started to fall apart. Other scientists tried to replicate Fleischmann and Pons's experiment, but a lot of them couldn't get the same results. The skepticism started to grow, and pretty soon, public opinion began to shift.
Right. And the scientific community, which tends to be pretty conservative, started to get really critical. There were questions about the data, the lack of a theoretical explanation, the difficulty in reproducing the results.
And let's be real, there were some egos involved too. Scientists felt like Fleischmann and Pons had jumped the gun, that they hadn't been careful enough with their research.
There was definitely a sense of competition, maybe even jealousy. If cold fusion was real, it would have been one of the biggest discoveries ever. And of course, everyone wanted to be a part of it.
It was like a scientific gold rush, right? Everyone trying to stake their claim.
Yeah.
But as the skepticism grew, cold fusion basically became this taboo subject.
It did. Funding dried up, labs were shut down, careers were ruined. Cold fusion became synonymous with bad science, with junk science. A lot of scientists wouldn't even mention it. They were afraid of hurting their reputation.
Yeah, it went from the hottest topic in science to basically the Voldemort of science. The thing that shall not be named.
That's a good way to put it. And that stigma, unfortunately, it stuck around. Even today, a lot of scientists are still hesitant to get involved in cold fusion research, even with this renewed interest that we're seeing.
Right. It's this weird paradox, right? You have this potentially world-changing technology that's been rejected by the very community that should be studying it. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there are a few reasons. One is, honestly, fear. Fear of being associated with something that's seen as pseudoscience. Scientists are really careful about their reputations. They don't want to be seen as supporting something that could hurt their credibility.
It's like this pressure to conform, to only support ideas that are already accepted. And anything that challenges those ideas, well, it gets met with resistance.
There is, definitely. It's called the establishment effect, and it's pretty powerful. It's not always a bad thing, though. It helps make sure that scientific claims are really tested and verified. But it can also stifle new ideas and make it hard for them to gain acceptance.
Right. It's like a filter that's supposed to weed out the bad ideas, but sometimes it accidentally weeds out the good ones too.
Exactly. And another thing that hurt cold fusion, I think, was how it was first presented to the public.
You mean the whole Fleischmann and Pons announcement?
Yeah. Looking back, I think they made a mistake by going public so early. Before other scientists had a chance to, really check their work, it created this huge media frenzy and got everyone's hopes up way too high.
Right, they basically tried to skip the whole peer review process.
They did. And it backfired. When other scientists couldn't reproduce their results, it created this huge sense of disappointment, even anger.
It's like they broke the rules of the game and they paid the price for it.
They did. And the whole field of cold fusion has been paying the price ever since.
So what does all of this mean for the future of cold fusion? Can a field that's been, so controversial, so tarnished, can it ever come back from that?
It's a good question. I think it's possible, but it's going to take a lot of work. The scientists who are working on cold fusion now, they know about the stigma, and they're trying to do things differently.
Okay, so what are they doing? How do you rebuild trust in a field that's been, well, let's just say it's taken some hits?
Well, for one thing, it's about being transparent, showing all your work, being really rigorous. No more rushing to announce results before they've been thoroughly checked.
Right, rebuilding credibility step by step.
Exactly. And it's also about working with the rest of the scientific community. Cold fusion researchers need to present their work at conferences, publish in peer-reviewed journals, let other scientists scrutinize their findings.
Basically, playing by the rules.
Right. And it's also about being patient. Changing people's minds takes time, especially with something as controversial as cold fusion. But if the research keeps showing promising results, if those results can be replicated by others, then I think the tide will eventually turn.
So it's a long road, but it's a road worth traveling.
I think so. I mean, the potential benefits of cold fusion are just too big to ignore. If we could figure this out, it would change the world.
It would. It's an amazing thought. But for now, it seems like cold fusion is still more about potential than reality. A scientific mystery with this whole social and historical puzzle wrapped around it.
It is, but it's a story that's still being written,
Yeah.
Who knows, maybe someday we'll look back at this time as like the dark ages of cold fusion, the time before we finally figured it out.
That's an interesting way to think about it. And on that note, I think we'll wrap things up for today. We've explored a lot in this deep dive, and hopefully our listeners have a better understanding of just how complex and fascinating cold fusion really is. It's a field full of challenges, but it's also full of possibilities.
It is. And it's a field that deserves our attention. Even if it turns out that, maybe it wasn't the miracle solution we were hoping for.
Well said. This is The Deep Dive, signing off.